Hi, and welcome to the lecture on feminist theory in criminology. So, feminist theory in criminology looks first to see what theories in criminology can be extended to explain the criminal actions of women. This is because most theories in criminology started with data that was usually exclusively based on men's criminal offending patterns, the crimes that men commit, and only had men in their data sets. And so the first part of feminist theory looked to see, okay, which of these theories, although they're based on men's actions and crimes that men have committed, can be extended to also explain the crimes that women commit. The second key part of feminist theory has looked to explain the gender differential in offending. In other words, we know from statistics that men are far more likely to commit crime than women. What most early criminological theories did not address is why that might happen. So feminist theory tries to address why men are more likely to commit crime than women. The history of feminist criminology is not all that long. I should first say that there are numerous branches of feminist criminology, and what unites all of those branches is that they're all arguing that women's experiences, both as victims of crime and as perpetrators of crime, should be included in the discussion of why crime occurs, when crime occurs, and how crimes occur, and how society should go about preventing crime. Initially, feminist criminologists were critiquing criminological theory and criminologists generally for ignoring women. Women weren't considered to be offenders. Women's experiences as victims weren't included either. They were assumed to be exactly like men, and so why would we bother discussing women who are victims of crime? We already have information from men who are victims of crime. So that was really the first approach. And another approach was to distort topics related to women in crime. So, for example, if a woman committed a murder, she could either be an instrument of the devil, so awful that she is no longer really a person. She has been overtaken by demons, and that is why she committed crime. Even after we got out of spiritual explanations of crime, you still saw women who committed murders to be held up as instruments of evil embodied, even though men who committed crime were not any longer treated that way. Or women were thought to be so pure and so soft that there's no way that they could commit murder, for instance. And so women who did plot and commit murders a lot of times got off because they were thought to be so incapable of doing anything so illegal or so awful. Feminist criminologists really rallied against both of these approaches and said, no, women may commit crime for different reasons than men. We should look at why men and women commit crime. But also that women weren't necessarily evil or necessarily perfect angels, and they should be treated like individuals who have committed crime, not as individuals who were overtaken by evil spirits or, on the other hand, too perfect to commit crime. Both of these approaches feminist criminologists saw as very gendered and very unfair towards women and men. Feminist criminologists also argued that criminology was ignoring socially constructed relationships between men and women that perpetuated crime. Women and men did not hold identical places in society. Both would probably argue they didn't hold ideal places in society either, but they didn't hold identical places in society, and those power relationships were also affecting why they committed crime and what types of crime they committed. So, for example, we know a lot of times when women steal, they do so because they are trying to feed their families. Women are more likely to steal items that are used to either feed their families or care for their families. So, like infant formula is one of the things that women are most likely to steal. Diapers are another thing that women are very likely to steal. Whereas the things that men are likely to steal are not centered around their families. And that for reasons like women are less likely to earn as much money as men do, contribute to why women steal, contribute to why women commit crime. So if you ignore pay differentials and caregiving relationships and those sort of things, you are ignoring part of the reasons why crime exists and why women in particular perpetuate crime. So you have to look at these socially constructed aspects of society in order to understand women's offending. If we want to talk about a couple of the first feminist criminologists, there was Frida Adler, and there was also Rita James Simon. Rita Simon was a prolific criminologist who actually taught at American University just right across the river in DC for many decades. She just died about 5 years ago. And actually, fun fact, many of the criminologists in Marymount's department studied under her, including myself. At first, many feminist writings in criminology could be described as part of traditional criminology itself, because they filled gaps and corrected distortions of the past. As such, they were part of what many term liberal feminism. Later, several strands of critical feminism arose that directly challenged the social structures within which liberal feminism operated. These structures looked at much more fundamental questions of how women had come to occupy subservient roles in society and how societies themselves might be transformed. The first such strand was known as radical feminism, and its central concept was that of patriarchy, usually a concept that sociologists used to describe social relationships under feudalism, whereas men dominated women in the family and in personal situations. Marxist feminists combined radical feminism with traditional Marxism to argue that the root of male dominance lied in men's ownership and control of the means of economic production. Marxist feminist criminologists argue that the actions that threaten the capitalist patriarchal system are defined as crimes by the law and by the criminal justice system. Thus, women's actions that threaten male economic dominance are defined as property crimes, and women's actions that threaten male control over women's bodies and sexuality were defined as sexual offenses. Finally, socialist feminists retained the focus on social roles and economic production, but they moved away from a rigid Marxist framework. Instead, they argued that natural reproductive differences between the sexes was what underlie male-female relationships. Authors tried to consider some of the most important topics in criminology and how they related to women in particular. Smart discussed how discourse was used to set certain women apart as quote-unquote criminal women, whereas Wonders argued that both postmodern feminism and feminism questioned the nature of justice as one that sought the quote-unquote truth, but was really an opinion of others, or opinion of some that benefited the elite, typically at the expense of others, or specifically the poor. Other feminists have criticized this belief. Chesney, Lynn, and Faith questioned whether it would be useful to women to dispute the notion of truth just at the point where women were gaining a voice in the knowledge production process, i.e. they questioned whether or not people should question whether a postmodern approach to studying crime is good for women, just when women were gaining the respect necessary to be part of the society that, or the elites that determined what is the truth or what is knowledge, and produce that knowledge, and were part of the system that, in the case of the criminal justice system, were in positions of power to have discretion to determine whether or not a law was broken, were policymakers and could help write the laws. Why would you then pursue a postmodern approach that invalidates the legitimacy of law and the legitimacy of truth? Still others appeared to reject postmodernism in particular because they advocated feminist theory and research that adhered to standards of scientific objectivity. Many feminists now take what is called appreciative relativism, which is a stance within feminism that is similar to postmodernism. That is to say that they recognize and appreciate many different feminist voices as legitimate, and they refrain from analyzing, classifying, and ultimately picking apart those different voices. Earlier feminism was wrought with many divisions within it. It was dominated by middle-class European American women, and it tended to consequently ignore the different experiences of, for instance, African American women. Within criminology, gender has usually been addressed in one of two ways. First is the generalizability problem that focuses on whether traditional criminology theories, which were formulated to explain male behavior, as I previously mentioned, can be generalized to explain female criminal behavior. The second focus is the gender ratio problem on explaining why women commit far less crimes, or far fewer crimes, than men. While generalizability is considered the safer problem to investigate, the problem that has been of more interest is the second one, the gender ratio problem, or explaining why men commit more crimes than women. Women criminologists who focus on the gender ratio problem as opposed to the generalizability problem have been more likely to utilize observations and interviews in their research and, quote, have displayed more tentativeness and a discomfort with making global claims, unquote, at the theoretical level. In contrast, the male criminologists who address the gender ratio problem have been bolder in making grand theoretical claims and have tended to do empirical research or that has involved statistical analysis. So the first lecture question for this week is to give a brief overview of feminist theory. Again, the first lecture question for this week is to give a brief overview of feminist theory based on the readings and the PowerPoint. This overview should be about 300 words. The problem for women criminologists is that global and grand theoretical arguments are the ones that the profession values most, and the profession also values data analysis more than it values qualitative methodology. Thus, many women criminologists have complained that their research has been trivialized as case studies or has been written off as not being theoretical enough. It also means that if that happens, these voices are forced out of academia and forced out of writing and publishing and researching. Researchers have argued that gender must become a central concept in criminology theories. Social class has been the main concept in most criminology theories throughout the existence of the profession, yet many criminologists argue that there's no relationship between class and crime, and we've been testing this for several decades on many different populations in many different countries, and we have found very few relationships between class and crime. In contrast, the relationship between gender and crime is very strong and undeniable. So there's the argument that criminologists have to theorize gender in their theories of crime. Their theories of crime must explain why men are more likely to commit crime in order for these theories to be valid. It also means that both men and women's experiences as offenders and victims, as well as their divergent treatment in the criminal justice system, can only be fully understood in the context of the sex-gender system that exists within societies. Feminist criminology has raised a wide number of issues that are related to women as offenders, women as victims, women's experiences within the criminal justice system, and all of these issues have implications for the existing criminological knowledge about men, too. However, most of the rest of this lecture is going to consider the gender ratio problem. For most of the 20th century, explanations of the gender ratio problem has focused on why women's crime rates are so low. But that approach assumes that male crime rates are the norms, and it attempts to explain why women's crime rates are so different from that norm. The opposite question, why are men's crime rates so high, is also a valid one and is also valid. In the first half of the 20th century, theories generally explained all crime in terms of biological and psychological disorders. By the 1950s, theories of men's criminality had turned to social explanations, such as ecology, strain, differential association, control, and labeling theories that were discussed earlier. Only with the rise of feminism in the 1960s and 1970s was women's criminality viewed as an entirely separate issue and was considered in relation to women's social circumstances. When we started studying women in crime, we started to think of many different perspectives on why women and men's crime rates differed. One of these perspectives said that females were more controlled than males, so they committed less crime. And this was particularly true in terms of direct controls, such as when they were under surveillance or when they were under supervision. An alternate perspective was that females females exhibited less crime because they were over-controlled by their patriarchal families, because their fathers had more power than their mothers, because the father was employed and the mother wasn't. Finally, there was the thought that males and females tended to face different types of strain, and male strains were more likely to be tied to crime than female strains. Last but not least, there was the idea that women had found themselves, or at least some women, learned to be criminals by finding themselves in a situation where their aunts, cousins, siblings, mothers, routinely engaged in crime, and that the women learned from these individuals. Some feminists looked at female criminality in the context of doing gender, and approached gender that assumed that female gender roles was something that had to be accomplished given the social circumstances of a certain place. This is also to note that female gender roles can be dysfunctional in certain ways, but that the greater problem lies in overconformity to roles in sexist societies. This was looked at in many different situations, such as drug markets in Brooklyn, armed robberies in St. Louis, and girls who were involved in gangs. Many have noted that women's, or the focus of feminist criminologists has meant that the profession has changed so that it's not just, women are so different than men, or women's crime rates are less, but has meant that men's gender has to be acknowledged by the profession, and that male behavior is no longer just the norm. There are some traditional criminology theories that propose causal factors that are unequally distributed by genders. For example, testosterone levels, which was a biological factor that we discussed in the early weeks of the class that can be associated with crime, is much more concentrated in men than in women. Some criminologists have argued that the profession is unwilling to accept that male violence flows from a combination of genes, chemicals, and environment. A different perspective says that women women commit less crime because there's different uses of aggression in girls and boys. This research says that while boys and girls differ little in their use of physical aggression in infancy, a gap widens over their lives, peaking between the ages of 18 and 30. And this gap means that it looks like women have the greater ability to regulate and inhibit their aggressive behavior. Finally, Gottfredson and Hirsch's theory says that boys may be allowed to have lower self-control mechanisms than girls, and thus girls are more likely to have high self-control and stable personalities in adolescence and adulthood. The second lecture question for this week is to find a crime that you think feminist theory does a good job explaining. Include a link to a newspaper article or online media article describing the crime, and in about 100 words, state why you think feminist theory does a good job explaining this crime. Lecture question number 3 for this week is to find a newspaper article or online media article that you think feminist theory does not do a good job explaining. Include a link to that article in your response and explain why you don't think feminist theory does a good job explaining that crime, citing both the PowerPoints and the reading. The fourth lecture question for this week is to give a 300 to 500 word overview of developmental and life course criminology.